Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with Trope Talk, Paragons this time around, by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. All right, Paragon. Typically good people. Don't really got anything else to add here. I'm gonna, this time around, for this Trope Talk, I'm not gonna ramble here at the beginning. We're going to dive in. We're going to listen to what Red says. And then I will interject now and then and see if I can ramble during the video.
Here's something that might surprise you. I am a huge sucker for classic Paragon heroes.
Oh, actually, yeah, that surprises me.
What can I say? I like characters that are good. I like seeing them make friends, help people, turn enemies into allies. I like Paragons. They're hopelessly cliche and have fallen out of fashion, but I love them anyway.
You know, that's one thing. Like, as I've been reading more and more, and I've been writing more and more, I'm quickly also realizing that I am a sucker for a lot of just the typical cliches. There's just, and I think maybe in part, I think the big reason is just that it's comfort. It's comfortable. You know, like the stereotypical cliche Paragon, you know, you can trust him. You can trust his viewpoint. You can trust what he says, right? You don't feel like you are being misled by the Paragon. So that brings comfort. And usually also the Paragon almost always succeeds. I mean, of course, if you're doing a doomed hero Paragon, which is, of course, a thing that can happen, and can be fun to do, which is what I like to do. I like doing that one. I've done that one. I think one of the novels I wrote has that. But anyways, yeah, it's just typically they succeed, so you kind of like, again, it's that just comfort, right? Like, even I think ultimately what it comes down to, and no, this is just a general writing observation slash thought of mine that I'm having right here off the top of my head, is that the ability to flip tropes on their head and do something different with them is relative to the skill of the writer. If you are not that skilled of a writer, but you go with the typical tropes, like you just go in line with the tropes and you write the typical progression of tropes, it still may not be all that well written, but one, it gets you more practice with writing, and two, I think you'll be forgiven a lot more as well. Like, because you're going down the typical tropes, people know what to expect, and they kind of, in a way, are more comforted by that. And that comfort, I feel like, personally, in my opinion, if I can trust an author either by the skill of their writing or that they're doing tropes that I recognize and can predict, I'm going to be comforted. And of course, the skill of that second one, the latter there, that comfort that I get, even though it may be a less well-written story, I'm still going to have a good time because I'm comfortable, because they are not trying to flip tropes on their head. Whereas, like, to flip tropes on their head, you have to be a skilled writer to really pull it off, right? Because there is a reason that tropes are tropes. There's a reason they are popular. Because they work. People like them. That's why they're tropes, right? So, like, A Song of Ice and Fire, if that was in the hands of a lesser writer than George, him flipping tropes on their head and him doing the grimdark tactic, it would not work. It would not be popular. It would not have gotten adapted by HBO. Okay, yeah, in my opinion. And Brandon Sanderson's Sanderlanches at the ends of his books. He was a lesser writer. Those Sanderlanches, one, most people would not be continuing to slog through the thick meat of his books to get to the Sanderlanches. But because people trust him as an author, because they find him good enough to make the slog worth it and ultimately satisfying, people get to those Sanderlanches and enjoy them, right? Like I personally would not recommend doing the Sanderlanche approach, even though it is fun to write. I've done it. However, the problem is if you're not exactly, it's again the skill of the writer. You have to be able to write something good enough, or get people curious enough where they want to get through the slog of the book to get to your avalanche at the end, where all the pieces really come together. And of course, Sanderson, I feel like, has mastered that. I haven't read another author yet that has been able to really capture those avalanches. Like, I love R.F. Kuang's Poppy War trilogy. She did not have any sort of Sanderlanches in any of the 3 Poppy War books. I also love John Gwynne. I've read both books in the Bloodsworn saga so far that have been released, and I read Faithful and the Fallen, the first series of it. I haven't read the sequel series, so just the first 4 books. None of those have avalanches in them, because that's not those authors' strengths. Again, tangent here of that I've said multiple times in other trope talks. Write a lot so that you can figure out what your strengths are, right? I have started to really figure out where my strengths as a writer are. And with each successive book that I've written, I've leaned more in onto those parts of my writing that I feel like I am best at. So, yeah. Anyways.
Now, this might be surprising because, as most of you know, I spend a lot of time talking about how realism can add creativity and meaning to stories and how textbook characters tend to be pretty boring, and, I stand by that. But the trick with the Paragon is that their character is almost never as important as how they affect other characters. What is there to say about a Paragon? They're good, they're friendly, they're forgiving, except in the case of truly evil beings. They might have a tragic backstory or a grand destiny, but practically speaking, they're good and open and try to do the right thing. They don't tend to struggle with the morality or the motivation of their actions, and their character development tends to be limited to finding new causes to champion. But what does that do to the characters they interact with? See, the Paragon hero does something to the people around them. They inspire. Sometimes their open friendliness ties the group together, sometimes their reflexive desire to help the helpless starts rubbing off on their more jaded friends, sometimes the sheer trust they place in someone makes that person want to fulfill that trust. You look at this guy and you just end up getting a big old case of the warm fuzzies just by the sheer positivity radiating off of him.
Sometimes I want to punch you in your perfect teeth.
And sometimes that happens. Actually, a lot of the time. Now, the point is, this character, this Paragon, is usually mostly important for the effect they have on the story as a whole. Sure, they have a unique-ish personality in there, but their behavior is generally going to be very predictable. I mean, there's only so nuanced a good person who does good can be. But what that character does do that's a little less predictable is draw other, more nuanced characters into the wake of their do-gooding. There are 2 main examples of this, and they're both really obvious. There's Superman, specifically from the cartoon, and there's Captain America from the MCU. Both start off doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do and they can do it. Both end up inspiring an increasing number of other heroes to follow in their footsteps, and both end up sort of leading an expanding crew of heroes. None as Paragon or as idealistic as they are, but all inspired to try and do what they did. This doesn't get much focus in the Justice League cartoon, but Cap Civil War actually kind of dissects this trope in a pretty clever way. If you've somehow managed to avoid seeing that movie, you might want to skip this part, but basically, literally everyone in this movie is of the opinion that, of course he's doing this, he's Captain Goddamn America. The only discrepancy is whether or not they're siding with him. The ones on his side are following him because he's Captain Goddamn America, while the ones opposing him are like, there's no use debating this with him because he's Captain Goddamn America and he's certain he's doing the right thing. Now it's a matter of furious debate if he is in the right, but the fact is that everyone involved in that—
By the way, Captain America was in the right. I think the MCU literally confirmed it themselves in one of their new shows or something, like where the Sokovia Accords have been revoked. Because again, Sokovia Accords, bad idea. Like, here's the thing, it's a question that they've kind of touched on, but they haven't, I feel like, expanded further into it. Because here's the thing, right? Like, I can't remember who mentioned it, but it's like, these guys are superheroes. And we know that because of Thor, that and Captain Marvel, that there are aliens and shit, and well, also Guardians of the Galaxy, aliens and shit that have better technology than Earth, and they're dangerous. And having superheroes on Earth draws attention to Earth. And so of course, right, you're gonna have, those problems. Or like Iron Man creating a fucking robot that almost kills the world. Which of course, the Sokovia Accords, the only person there that really should have gotten in trouble was fucking Tony Stark. The rest of the Avengers didn't do shit. They were trying to help Tony Stark fix his shit that he created. But really, it was Tony's fault. Like, no one else's. But yeah, then to be brought under a government thing. Like, Captain America has worked for the government. He knows the government's very slow in acting and also can be easily corrupt. And in the previous movie, Winter Soldier, Hydra was a problem. Hydra was a big problem within the government. So, Sokovia Accords, bad idea.
That whole fiasco is involved because of Cap, either because they're on his side or they know the only way to stop him is by brute force. Now, Cap is actually supremely oblivious to the sheer weight of charisma he's lugging around, case in point, but more specifically, when he asks the other heroes for help, he's disregarding the fact that most of them will side with him just by virtue of the fact that he's Captain Goddamn America, regardless of what cause he happens to be championing. It doesn't seem to occur to him that he probably inspired most of them to do everything they're doing. Tony's having to appeal to people's bigger picture sense of logic, but Cap just has to flash his stoic handsomeness in their direction and they're gravitating to his side like it's a thing to do. Because he's the focus, because he's the one who inspired them all, he's also the linchpin that makes them fall apart. Everything that happens in this movie happens because Captain America is so much of a presence that everybody is orienting themselves around him by necessity. Hey!
I really love Captain America Civil War. I really love it. My top 3 MCU movies, I think, are Winter Soldier, Civil War, in no particular order. I don't think I could really rank them. But it's Civil War, Winter Soldier, and Infinity War. Those are my top 3. Rounding out the top 5, Thor, Ragnarok, and then I can't. Probably Ant-Man or Ant-Man 2. I really like the Ant-Man movies. I really like the 2 Ant-Man movies. They're fun. They're a good time to me. They're not ones that like kind of make you think a bit more on the MCU like Winter Soldier and Civil War do, but they're a good time. And Paul Rudd's fucking awesome, dude. But yeah, when the MCU leaned into the complexities of Captain America himself and his relationship with the others in the Avengers was when the MCU, I think, was at their best, right? When they leaned into those complexities of like the relationships people have like Captain America. We see that with Winter Soldier, him trying to win Bucky back. Civil War, the fucking fallout from Ultron, and why everyone, like, them falling apart because Captain America and Tony are disagreeing. You know, you have the man that thinks he's in charge of the Avengers and wants to be in charge of the Avengers, and then you have the man that doesn't think he's in charge but is in charge, like, who doesn't care about being in charge but is the one in charge. In Cap. But this is cool. And then Infinity War, they lose. And also I really liked Cap in Infinity War. I thought he was fucking dope there. He doing some cool shit. But yeah, the MCU really, to me, was at their strong. Like, of course, Iron Man started the whole thing, but for me, Cap really brought it to the peak, just because of how his character serves the relationships with everyone. You know.
Hey, I think I finally figured out why this wasn't branded as an Avengers movie. Alright, spoilers done.
Yeah, he's right.
Short of it is, Civil War is something of a dissection of the hero inspiring others effect and where it can lead. Now, of course, it's less of an idealistic situation, but it's still a remarkably interesting look into the potential power and devastation that a Paragon can wreak through sheer force of personality. And whenever this character appears in anime specifically, the most common thing for them to do is to turn all of their even slightly redeemable enemies into allies within the space of a season or less. The thing is, the most interesting part of the Paragon character is that they're basically a catalyst for character development in other people. We've touched on how this can turn villains into heroes and heroes into more heroic heroes, but they can also sometimes trigger wacky existential crises and straight up villains just because of their sheer goodness. Going back to Cap for a minute, if we look at the first movie, we find this moment where the Red Skull is monologuing about how they're both gods among men, yada yada yada, to which Cap responds with, "I'm just a kid from Brooklyn." And this makes Skull go berserk. See, Red Skull sees himself in Cap, or rather, sees what he should have been, a textbook ubermensch with the looks and power to make the title appropriate. So when he hears Cap's "just a kid from Brooklyn" thing, his ego can't handle it. It's a classic case of evil can't comprehend good, which is a trope on its own, but basically Cap's sheer frank humility causes him to actually lose his cool and break down. And this is actually pretty typical in the cases where the bad guy turns into a good guy later as well. Usually something the hero's doing is totally weird to them, and their difficulty puzzling it out leads to them re-examining their priorities in some way. Or like Scully up there, it makes him self-destruct. But see, the Paragon themselves is a confusing archetype. As we've defined them, what makes them the Paragon is their general goodness and their tendency to accumulate people trying in some way to live up to their example. But there are a ton of different Paragons in literature, and they're all very distinct characters. They're not all nice, they don't all trust easily, some are doing good simply because good needs doing, and some are rising the face of concrete adversity. I mean, for crying out loud, Son Goku doesn't even do good on purpose. His motivation is and has always been to get stronger and fight people. There's no moral compass involved. And as crazy as it sounds, on the opposite end of the Paragon spectrum, Batman is a Paragon hero. He knows right from wrong and does the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That's really all you need. And with the extended Bat fam, it's obvious he's got the inspiring part down too. So given the crazy range of character types that fall under the Paragon umbrella, how do you write a Paragon? I mean, we haven't even really been able to define Paragons. We've just identified a way they're used in the story with relation to the other characters. That doesn't tell us anything about them as a character, it just gives us a few traits that can each manifest in a whole bunch of different ways.
Man, I wish I could talk as clearly, succinctly, and wisely as Red. Like, she is so damn good at getting her points and thoughts across. It's unfathomable for me to do the same. Like, I can't. I wish I could do that. I can't. I'm not. Damn it. I want to be like that.
Seems like it should be the easiest question in the world to answer, but the more we look at what makes a Paragon character, the less we seem to know. See, the Paragon actually has a lot of leeway in how they're characterized. We only have two defining traits, that they generally do good when good can be done, and that other characters kind of flock to them, whether as allies or enemies or something in between. This gives us a ton of possibilities for the actual character, so long as we adhere to those two traits. They can be bright and optimistic or struggling with trauma, open and trusting or a little more closed off, they might have a dark side or just be a straight up nice person with no caveats. The Paragon can be almost anyone so long as they act, Paragon. And this also means they can be flawed. I know, crazy, right? The desire for realistically flawed characters seems to have pulled the image of protagonist away from Paragon, but all you need for a Paragon is a person who does the right thing whenever they can. That doesn't mean they're a perfect human being. For an example of a flawed Paragon, let's look at cartoon-era Superman again. Supes is a lot of things, hero being the most obvious, but he's not perfect. In fact, his biggest flaw is an inability to trust other people to do things right. See, Superman is the most powerful hero on Earth, and he knows it. This awareness manifests in positive and negative ways. On the positive side of things, he has this tendency to fling himself in the way of stuff that could seriously hurt his squishier teammates or the world at large because he's very aware of how fragile everything is. But on the negative side of things, he kind of puts himself in charge of everything because he believes on some level that he can take care of everything. See, Superman never internalized the idea that he might not be able to do everything on his own. Even Batman is more of a team player than he is. Unfortunately, this becomes dangerous when he disagrees with the League, because whenever that happens, he does things his way anyway. Superman doesn't really respect anybody as an equal, and as a result, he's pretty quick to drop the team player thing when he thinks he could do a better job himself. This is mostly visible when Lex Luthor is involved, since Superman is pretty quick to assume Lex is up to no good, and even though he's always right, Lex is very good at playing him and making him look like a paranoid demigod holding a grudge. Superman is still unconditionally a Paragon hero, but that specific character flaw makes him actually very dangerous, as seen in the popular alternate universe where he decides the right thing to do involves murdering someone and taking over the world. So yeah, even Paragons can be less than one step away from becoming horrible, horrible dictators. It's just a matter of putting them in situations where their personal definition of the right thing to do doesn't necessarily mesh with ours. And that's actually one of the most interesting things to do with Paragons. See, it's never really a surprise when your Paragon does something good. Sometimes stories will put a Paragon in a situation where the right thing to do might be dangerous or personally offensive to them, but because they're Paragons, they're gonna do it anyway. If you really want your Paragon hero to act unpredictably or dangerously or in a way that has your audience going, "Ho, don't do it," you put them into a situation that appeals to their humanity, not their heroism. Superman kills President Lex Luthor in the alternate timeline because Luthor had killed the Flash, and Superman, guided in part by grief, in part by rage, and in part by a misplaced feeling of responsibility, decided the right thing to do was prevent Luthor from ever doing anything that bad again. He subsequently took over the world because he decided the right thing to do was preventing anyone from ever doing anything that bad again. Back on the Marvel side of things, Cap kicked off the events of Civil War because his brainwashed buddy was in danger and he decided the right thing to do was to protect him, even at the cost of his friends being stuck in a super gulag. See, Paragons can actually be really dangerous, and therefore, from a writing perspective, really interesting, because if you can get them to think that the right thing to do is something objectively dangerous or bad, they'll pursue it with the same single-minded stubbornness they do all their good deeds with. Now this actually gives you an interesting possibility, making a Paragon an antagonist to your hero. See, when the story isn't centered on the Paragon, they can unsurprisingly come across as pretty annoying. They've got this tendency to assume that their own moral compass must be universal, so if your protagonist happens to be in more of a gray area, they might take offense. And if your character has the misfortune to be something generally considered evil by default, like a demon or monster, a Paragon who sees them as inherently irredeemable might end up being their greatest threat. See, Paragons are almost never written with any kind of character development that forces them to re-examine their definition of good. When it comes to right and wrong, they're intensely stubborn, and any kind of stubbornness in a character has the potential to become dangerous in the wrong situations. As a result, it's actually very easy to show the flaws in a Paragon character without compromising their Paragonness. And this is important because Paragons, traditional, shining, perfect Paragons, have fallen out of fashion as a result of the trend towards gritty, flawed realism. So as a result of that shift, we get to see DC's greatest Paragons, Batman and Superman, each lose their ingrained sense of right and wrong and start conforming to the letter of their characterization but not the spirit. Case in point, Batman killing in the more recent movies. And that's kind of, it's not really what their characters are for.
I wanted to read that. Batman v Superman was a cinematic masterpiece, and if you were a real DC fan, you'd think that even if you hated every second of it.
Alright, simmer down. My point is, you don't need to sacrifice a character's Paragonness to make them less than perfect. Paragons already aren't perfect. They're stubborn, they tend to think of themselves as the highest authority on their own behavior, and they can be really dangerous if that clashes with reality. They're not gritty flaws, but they can be devastating, and you can tell a lot of interesting, and yes, dark stories about a Paragon's influence on their world without sacrificing their Paragon nature. So I guess maybe instead of making all our heroes and villains gritty, flawed, moral gray areas, we could start throwing in some characters that are dangerously certain that they're doing the right thing. I don't know, could be fun. So, yeah.
And that was Trope Talk Paragons by Overly Sarcastic Productions. This was a good one. It was 10 minutes long, but it felt like she covered... this is one of the shorter ones, and it felt like she covered everything pretty in depth here. I feel like there wasn't much more. Like, there have been other of these shorter trope talks where I've felt like there was more for her to say, But this one for Paragons, I feel like it's pretty wrapped up. It was pretty good. Nothing else really to say. Add on, nothing else needed. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.